What's up, folks? It's Tom DeQuino back with another HAVOC podcast Microaggressions series episode. The Microaggressions series focuses on contributions to the hacker community, and today we're going to profile Saad Ahla. Saad is a red team developer and EDR evasion specialist that goes by the handle Dark Matter. He's also a Hack the Box instructor and content developer. I chose to profile Saad in this episode because he's still at the early stage of his cybersecurity career. He's mostly self taught, but he's already making interesting contributions to cybersecurity research. So I'm going to focus on two of Saad's projects in particular. The first is his VirusTotal C2 project, and the second will be his GitHub C2 project. Now, both of these are proof of concept C2 projects, and I say proof of concept because they don't have the typical native post-compromise capabilities built in that more robust C2 frameworks have. But I don't think that detracts from the novelty of the projects whatsoever, which is why I'm covering it here. The VirusTotal C2 project basically uses a VirusTotal API as the only communications channel between the C2 server and the implant. It would require a red team operator or the attacker operating the C2 to have a VirusTotal account. And the reason for that is that the server and the implant both require a VirusTotal API key to be able to interface with the VirusTotal API. But it works with a free tier VirusTotal account. Basically, the server and the implant interact with each other by adding comments to a VirusTotal file entry. So when the server sends an instruction to the implant, it base64 encodes the instruction and then writes it as a comment on a VirusTotal file entry that you specify. The implant then reads the comments from the same file and writes its responses back as base64 encoded comments on that same file. So basically, when you execute the binary, both the C2 server binary and the implant binary, you specify a file hash of a file that's been previously uploaded to VirusTotal, and the implant will, use that file hash and the API calls that it's making, and the C2 server, same thing. It uses that file hash and the API calls. And allows it to basically post comments to the file. There's a couple things about this. The files are publicly accessible in VirusTotal. So if somebody happened to stumble across the file that you're using to post comments to, they would be able to see that the interactions basically, although they'd be base64 encoded, it'd be a little bit tedious to go decode all of those interactions to see exactly what happened, but it would be possible. So also, I think somewhat of a mitigation from the standpoint that there are so many files in VirusTotal that somebody, just stumbling across maybe a simple, very small amount of data in a text file that you uploaded to VirusTotal is probably not going to match any YARA rules or anything like that. So the chances of somebody stumbling across it pretty minimal. So because of that, I think you could mitigate the risk of that to some degree. Couple of notes about it, though. The project is written in C++. Saad does not provide binary releases for either of these projects. Actually, you have to compile them yourself, which I think is smart. There's not releases out there for people to just go download and submit to VirusTotal, right? So there's that benefit, I suppose, but it also requires you to have some degree of technical capability in order to go compile this thing on your own and be able to run it. I'm not super fluent in C++. In fact, I almost never work with it, right? So I tried to compile this thing in Visual Studio Code and it didn't work. So there you go. That's an example of maybe a little bit of a barrier to entry to the script kiddies, right? Anyway, pretty easy to test, all things considered, after I got through some of the stumbling blocks that are a result of my own idiocy. But pretty cool project. Was fun to work with, test it out. We'll come back to some of the challenges that I ran into with actually using the C2 in a minute. First, let's move on to the GitHub C2 project. It's basically a really similar concept, uses the GitHub API as the only communication channel between the C2 server and the implant. Again, red team operator controlled GitHub account is required here. The implant and the C2 server both require a GitHub API key to be able to interface with the API. In this case, the server and implant interact with each other by posting issues to a GitHub repository. So similar to the way somebody would report a bug on a piece of on a GitHub project, they'll go to the repository and file an issue for that particular repo. That's basically what the implant and server are doing back and forth to communicate. The server will post an issue, which the implant reads, carries out the instruction, and then posts its response back in its own issue. And on and on the communication goes. So in terms of actually using these, while I was doing the testing with these two utilities, basically the primary challenge that I encountered was the API quotas that are enforced by VirusTotal and GitHub. So the VirusTotal limit is 240 API requests per hour. And given that you have the server and the implant both interacting with the API, presumably using the same API key, that quota gets hit pretty quickly. So maybe you could mitigate that by having two separate VirusTotal accounts and two separate API keys. I suppose could potentially work, but still pretty low limit that you're going to hit pretty quickly. GitHub is a little more flexible with a quota of 1,000 API requests per repository per hour. But again, for the sake of this proof of concept, that limit's probably going to put a bit of a damper on how much interaction the server and implant will be able to have. All that said, though, in my opinion, both projects accomplish their intended purpose, which is to challenge our expectations and push the limits of what's possible, right? And that's definitely achieved with I think both of these projects. In terms of practical application, I could see a scenario where a sophisticated threat actor implements their own C2 channel through GitHub. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first being that issues aren't the only medium that could potentially be used in GitHub. There are lots of objects available via the GitHub API that could potentially be used as the intermediary, data exchange for the C2 server and the implant. So lots of different ways that this could be, or at least a handful of different ways that this could be implemented. I think the other reason I think it's plausible is because of the way they enforce those quota limits. Given that they're per repository quota limits, I could see a scenario where, basically the C2 operator is checking their current quota limit status. And then when they're getting close to that limit, creating a new repository and then migrating the communication to that new repository. And all of those steps actually can be accomplished through the GitHub API. So you can make a call to check your the current user quota status. You can make a call to create a new repository. And then from there, some instruction to the C2 to the implant to migrate itself to the new repository. Basically, that full sequence could be accomplished or implemented in code in the C2 framework. So while that's not part of Saad's implementation of this, again, this is a proof of concept to demonstrate that this is possible. And if someone were to actually try to do this as a fully functional C2 that they were using to carry out a real lengthy campaign, I'd definitely imagine that they'd go to that trouble to implement some kind of control protocol in there to handle that check, repository creation, and then subsequent repository migration. So given that the GitHub C2 concept is practically viable, and the traffic is HTTPS encrypted, it's a trusted API, all of these things together gives me the impression that this is, would be a pretty valuable network evasion technique for a threat actor to use. So I'm going to give it an A+ rank in that perspective. The virus total C2, a little less practical, although super novel in terms of abusing a trusted API. So a really cool concept. Not as practically useful. So I'm going to give that one a B rank. But again, still really cool in terms of functionality. So in terms of detecting a C2 framework that abuses trusted APIs in this manner, how you're going to detect this is going to vary depending on how it's implemented, right? Which means signature detection is probably not a great approach. Anytime somebody develops a new implementation of this, you're going to have to know of its existence and then figure out if there's something directly in that communication that you can use to detect it. And it's probably going to require some proxy based SSL decryption in between, at the perimeter, inspecting, decrypting all the traffic going out, and then inspecting it from there, right? So that's first just an implementation challenge from a detection standpoint. But then secondly, with each one of the variances that might come from implementing something like this within the various C2 frameworks, yeah, I could see that being really challenging to keep up with. And so, ultimately, I think some kind of machine learning based approach is probably going to be your best bet to being able to detect this kind of activity. But even then, you're going to have varying degrees of effectiveness depending on what approach you use, how you tune the models, et cetera. So all of that, I think, makes actually for a really great future research episode topic. So keep an eye out for that. I'll get to work on putting something together around actually analyzing the traffic in more detail and seeing what features might be available for us to use as a detection mechanism. But in the meantime, if you know anyone that you think I should profile here in another microaggressions episode, drop me a line at tom@havoc.sh. And if you'd like to follow Saad, you'll be able to find the links to his LinkedIn and GitHub profiles in this podcast episode's show notes, along with links to the specific C2 projects I covered today. So definitely check that out. And a hat tip to you, Saad. Really great work, man. Keep it up. Just awesome to see some of the creativity that you're exploring here, and I can't wait to see what you do with more of it in the future. Until next time, folks, go forth and create havoc.